that night, the world went silent. The night the oil routes went silent, something changed across the desert. Bases went on alert. Ships stopped moving, and radio signals began to disappear. But far from the command centers, far from the news reports, one soldier was already walking. No vehicles, no backup, just a long road across the desert, and a promise waiting at the end of it. Because somewhere far beyond the sand, someone was still waiting for him to come home. The desert had a way of making the world feel small. During the day, it stretched endlessly under the sun, waves of heat rising from the sand like invisible tides. At night, it became something else entirely, a quiet ocean of darkness where the stars looked close enough to touch. Sergeant Daniel Cole had spent enough months there to know both sides of it, but that night felt different. He stood outside the operations building of the desert base, arms crossed, watching the horizon fade into deep blue darkness. The wind carried grains of sand across the ground in soft whispers. Somewhere far beyond the desert, ships were waiting. The news had begun, spreading quietly through radios, command channels, and satellite briefings. Oil tankers had slowed to a standstill, not destroyed, not sunk, just waiting. The narrow sea routes that carried much of the world's oil had suddenly become uncertain. And when the flow of oil hesitates, the entire world starts paying attention. Daniel didn't pretend to understand global politics. That wasn't his job. His job was simple. Protect the routes, protect the convoys, protect the people moving through the desert, and one day return home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small photo he carried everywhere. Sarah stood in the middle of the picture, sunlight in her hair, laughing at something outside the frame. Emma sat on her shoulders, holding her mother's head with tiny hands, smiling wide enough to brighten the entire photograph. Daniel brushed dust from the corner of the photo. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the edges had softened. "Still looking at that picture, Cole?" Daniel turned. Sergeant Reyes leaned against the doorway, holding 2 steaming metal cups. "Coffee?" Reyes said. Daniel accepted it. They stood quietly for a moment. Out here, silence was normal. Reyes finally spoke again. "You hear the briefing?" Daniel nodded slightly. "About the shipping routes?" Reyes took a sip of coffee. "Not just that." Daniel looked at him. Reyes lowered his voice. "Multiple bases across the region just went into elevated alert." Daniel frowned. "For what reason?" Reyes shook his head. "They didn't say much. Just increased patrols, restricted airspace, more surveillance flights." Daniel looked back toward the dark horizon. Convoy trucks rolled slowly across the base in the distance. Generators hummed. Radio towers blinked red lights into the night. Everything looked normal, but something in the atmosphere felt different, heavier, as if the entire desert was waiting. Reyes continued quietly. "Command says tensions around the Gulf are rising. Some installations reported unusual activity earlier tonight." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He finished his coffee and placed the cup on the metal railing beside him. "Orders?" Reyes sighed. "Convoy escort at dawn." Daniel nodded. That was routine. Convoys moved through the desert every day, carrying supplies, fuel, equipment. But tonight, even routine felt uncertain. A transport helicopter passed slowly overhead, its rotor blades cutting the quiet night air. Daniel watched it disappear into the darkness. Reyes spoke again. "You ever get the feeling something big is about to happen?" Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered calmly, Every soldier feels that at some point. Reyes smirked. Great. Daniel slipped the photograph back into his pocket. No matter what happens, he said quietly, there's only one direction I'm walking when this is over. Reyes looked at him. Home? Daniel nodded. Home. Across the desert horizon, distant radar towers rotated slowly against the stars. Somewhere, far beyond the sand, the world was shifting, and none of them knew yet how far that change would reach. Morning arrived slowly over the desert. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in pale orange and dusty gold. The air was still cool, one of the rare quiet moments before the heat would rise and turn the sand into a furnace. Inside the base, engines were already running. Convoys didn't wait for the sun. Sergeant Daniel Cole tightened the straps on his vest as he stepped outside the operations building. The low hum of armored trucks filled the air. Rows of vehicles stood ready. Fuel carriers, supply trucks, escort vehicles, everything moved with quiet efficiency. This was routine. At least, it used to be. Daniel walked toward the convoy while soldiers checked radios and secured cargo. A few helicopters sat at the far end of the base, their rotors motionless but ready. Reyes was leaning against one of the escort vehicles, scanning a tablet. You look like someone who didn't sleep, Reyes said without looking up. Daniel smirked slightly. Welcome to the club. Reyes finally glanced at him. Command updated the briefing this morning. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Reyes nodded. More alerts. Daniel sighed. The rumors from the night before had only grown. Across the region, several bases had increased security levels overnight. Extra patrols, more surveillance flights, radar stations operating around the clock. No one used the word conflict, but everyone could feel the tension. Daniel climbed into the passenger seat of the lead escort vehicle. Reyes slid into the driver's seat. You ever notice how the world's problems always find their way into the desert? Reyes asked. Daniel looked out through the windshield as the convoy slowly began to roll forward. Dust lifted behind the tires. Oil runs through this desert, Daniel said. Where oil goes, Reyes finished the sentence. The world follows. The convoy moved through the gates of the base. Ahead of them stretched miles of empty desert road, wide, flat, endless. In the distance, pipelines cut across the sand like dark scars, carrying fuel from distant fields toward ports and refineries far beyond the horizon. For decades, those routes had been the quiet arteries of the modern world. Now they felt fragile. Daniel adjusted the radio headset on his ear. Convoy leader to all units. Maintain formation. Static crackled softly. One by one, the trucks confirmed. The vehicles rolled deeper into the desert. Wind pushed small waves of sand across the asphalt. For a while, no one spoke. Hours passed like that. Just engines, wind, and the endless road. Reyes finally broke the silence. My brother called again last night, he said. Daniel looked over. Everything okay? Reyes nodded. Yeah, just worried. People back home are watching the news non-stop. Daniel understood. When tension rises in the Gulf, the entire world starts paying attention. Fuel, trade, supply chains. Things people rarely think about suddenly become headlines. Daniel leaned back in the seat. You ever think about how strange it is? He asked. Reyes frowned slightly. What? Daniel gestured toward the convoy behind them. Half the world depends on routes like this, and most people will never see them. Reyes chuckled. Probably better that way. Daniel smiled faintly. The road stretched on. The sun climbed higher. Heat began to shimmer above the sand. Then, the radio crackled again. "Convoy leader, report position." Daniel grabbed the microphone. "Checkpoint Delta, approaching in 5 minutes." Static again. Then, silence. Reyes glanced at him. "You hear that?" Daniel listened. The radio channel was suddenly too quiet. Normally, there were always voices, updates, status checks, but now the line was empty. The convoy slowed slightly as they approached the checkpoint. A small outpost stood beside the road, a radar tower, a communications antenna, and a concrete building partially buried in sand. But something looked wrong. Daniel leaned forward. "Where's the patrol team?" Reyes narrowed his eyes. "No vehicles, no soldiers, no movement, only the wind." The convoy rolled to a cautious stop. Daniel stepped out of the vehicle, scanning the empty outpost. The desert stretched silent in every direction. Something wasn't right. Reyes stepped beside him. "You think they moved positions?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." He looked toward the distant horizon. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel said quietly, "Something changed out here." And neither of them knew yet that this empty checkpoint would be the moment their mission turned into the longest journey of Daniel Cole's life. The desert wind moved slowly through the empty checkpoint. It pushed loose sand across the cracked pavement and against the concrete walls of the small outpost. Sergeant Daniel Cole stood still for a moment, studying the scene. Something about the silence felt wrong. Checkpoints like this were never empty. There should have been at least 6 soldiers stationed there, rotating shifts, monitoring communications, watching the surrounding roads, but now there was nothing. No voices, no engines, no movement. Only the low hum of the radar tower, turning slowly above the outpost. Reyes walked toward the main building and pushed the metal door open. It creaked loudly. Inside, equipment was still running. Computer screens glowed softly in the dim room. Maps of the region covered one wall. A radio console blinked with waiting signals, but the chairs were empty. Reyes looked around. "Looks like they left in a hurry." Daniel stepped inside. On one of the desks sat a half-finished cup of coffee, still warm. Daniel frowned. "They didn't leave long ago." Reyes walked over to the radio console and tried the communication channel. "Delta checkpoint requesting status update." Static answered. He tried another channel, more static. Daniel studied the map on the wall. Several supply routes crossed through the desert in thin lines. Fuel transport routes, logistics routes, oil infrastructure corridors. For decades, those paths had connected the desert to the rest of the world. And now, something was interrupting that flow. Daniel turned toward the doorway. "Check the radar logs." Reyes nodded and began scrolling through the terminal. Outside, the convoy drivers remained in their vehicles, waiting for instructions. Engines idled quietly. Dust swirled slowly in the warm air. Reyes suddenly leaned closer to the screen. "Daniel, take a look at this." Daniel stepped beside him. On the radar monitor, several aircraft signals had passed through the region earlier in the night. Unscheduled, unidentified. Daniel narrowed his eyes. That wasn't in the briefing. Reyes shook his head. "Nope." Daniel stared at the radar data for a moment. Then he looked toward the open desert through the doorway. Something was unfolding across the region. Bases entering alert, ships waiting in the Gulf. Unusual aircraft activity. And now, an abandoned checkpoint. None of it made sense yet, but soldiers learn to recognize patterns before they understand them. Daniel turned back toward the convoy outside. "We can't stay here." Reyes nodded. "Agreed." Daniel stepped outside and signaled to the convoy leader. "Prepare to move." The drivers acknowledged. Engines roared slightly louder as the vehicles prepared to continue the route. Daniel climbed back into the escort vehicle. Reyes started the engine. The convoy slowly rolled past the silent checkpoint. As they drove away, Daniel looked back once more through the rear window. The radar tower continued spinning slowly in the wind, watching the empty desert, and for the first time since the mission began, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, something deeper, a quiet sense that the path ahead would not be the one they expected. The desert road stretched endlessly ahead of the convoy. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, bending the horizon into a wavering mirage. The sun was now high in the sky, turning the metal bodies of the trucks into bright reflections of light. Inside the escort vehicle, Sergeant Daniel Cole watched the road while adjusting the radio dial. Still nothing. The communication channels remained strangely quiet since they left the abandoned checkpoint. Normally, the desert routes were full of small signals, patrol updates, aircraft reports, routine check-ins from nearby installations. Now there was only static. Reyes glanced toward the sky. "You see that?" Daniel followed his gaze. Far in the distance, along the western horizon, a dark wall stretched across the desert. At first it looked like a shadow, but shadows don't move like that. Reyes exhaled slowly. Sandstorm. Daniel studied the approaching cloud. The desert wind was already beginning to shift. "Big one," he said. Behind them, the convoy trucks continued rolling in formation, carrying supplies and fuel along the narrow road that cut through the sand. These storms were common in the region, but something about this one felt different. Within minutes, the sky began to change. The bright blue faded into a dull yellow haze. Wind pushed harder against the vehicles. Sand began to strike the windshield like tiny grains of glass. Daniel grabbed the radio microphone. "Convoy leader to all vehicles, storm incoming, maintain visual distance." One by one, the drivers confirmed. Visibility began to drop. The horizon disappeared. The world shrank to a small circle of road and dust around each vehicle. The storm arrived faster than expected. Within moments, the desert was swallowed by swirling sand. Wind howled across the road. The convoy slowed to a crawl. Reyes leaned closer to the windshield. "I can barely see the truck in front of us." Daniel tightened his grip on the dashboard. "Keep steady." The radio crackled again, but this time, the signal broke apart in pieces. Visibility. Losing. Static swallowed the rest. Daniel tried to respond, but the signal was already gone. Sand blasted across the vehicles with increasing force. The sky above them disappeared entirely. Only orange dust remained. The convoy began to lose formation. One truck faded from view, then another. Reyes cursed quietly. "We're blind out here." Daniel looked behind them. The road was gone. The horizon was gone. Everything was gone except the storm. Another burst of static hit the radio. "Repeat. Convoy. Regroup." Then silence. The storm roared louder. The vehicle shook under the pressure of the wind. Daniel realized something in that moment. They were no longer a convoy. They were just vehicles, lost inside a moving wall of sand. Reyes slowed the vehicle almost to a stop. "We can't keep driving like this." Daniel nodded. "Pull over." Reyes steered carefully toward the side of the road, or what he believed was the side. In the storm, It was impossible to tell. The vehicle stopped. Wind screamed around them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They waited, listening, hoping the storm would pass quickly. But desert storms rarely followed human schedules. After a while, Daniel opened the door and stepped outside. The wind nearly pushed him backward. Sand blasted against his uniform. The world around him was nothing but swirling orange darkness. No trucks, no road, no horizon, only storm. Reyes stepped out behind him. "You see anything?" Daniel shook his head. "Nothing." They waited. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Slowly, the wind began to weaken. The storm drifted eastward, leaving the desert behind in heavy silence. The air cleared. Shapes slowly returned. First the road, then the distant dunes, then the sky. But something was missing. Daniel turned slowly in a full circle. The convoy was gone. Not one truck remained in sight. Only their escort vehicle stood alone in the middle of the desert road. Reyes spoke quietly. "That's not good." Daniel looked toward the empty horizon. The radio crackled again, but the signal was weak and broken. Units, report, location. Daniel tried to answer. "Convoy leader, this is Cole." Static, no reply. Reyes looked at him. What now? Daniel took a slow breath. The desert stretched endless in every direction. Somewhere out there, the rest of the convoy had scattered. Somewhere out there, the road continued. And somewhere far beyond, the desert, home, waited. Daniel climbed back into the vehicle. He adjusted the radio one more time. Then he said calmly, "We find the road." Reyes nodded. "And if the road disappears?" Daniel looked toward the horizon. Then he answered quietly, "Then we start walking." Neither of them realized yet that those words would soon become reality. The desert returned to silence after the storm. The sky was clear again, stretching wide and endless above the empty road. The air still carried fine grains of sand, drifting slowly across the pavement. Sergeant Daniel Cole stood beside the escort vehicle and scanned the horizon once more. Still nothing. No trucks, no radio signals, no movement, just the desert. Reyes leaned against the open door of the vehicle. "Maybe the convoy kept moving while we stopped." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's possible." He picked up the radio microphone again and tried another channel. "Convoy leader, this is Sergeant Cole requesting location update." Static. He waited. Nothing. Reyes sighed. "Communication towers might still be down after the storm." Daniel looked at the sun. It had already begun its slow descent across the sky. If they waited too long, darkness would fall over the desert, and desert nights were far colder than most people imagined. Daniel turned toward the vehicle. "Let's keep moving." Reyes started the engine. The vehicle rolled forward along the empty road. For nearly 30 minutes they drove through the silent desert. Then something happened. A strange vibration passed through the steering wheel. Reyes frowned. "You feel that?" Daniel did. A low, grinding noise followed. Then a loud metallic snap echoed beneath the vehicle. The engine coughed once, then stopped. Silence returned. Reyes tried the ignition again. The engine turned, but it refused to start. He tried again. Nothing. Reyes opened the hood and stepped outside. Daniel joined him. The hot desert air wrapped around them again. Reyes inspected the engine for several minutes. Finally, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his uniform. "That's not good." Daniel already knew the answer. What failed? Reyes pointed deeper into the engine compartment. Fuel pump line. Sand. Probably got into the system during the storm. Daniel looked down the empty road stretching toward the horizon. Can it be fixed? Reyes shook his head slowly. Not out here. The wind moved softly across the desert again. Daniel checked the radio one more time. Still nothing. No signal, no contact. Reyes leaned against the vehicle and looked at the endless dunes surrounding them. Well, this is not how I imagined the day going. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Me neither. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Reyes spoke again. So what's the plan, Sergeant? Daniel looked at the road ahead. Then, behind them, the desert stretched in both directions without mercy. But soldiers learn something early in their careers. Standing still rarely solves problems. Daniel walked to the back of the vehicle and opened the storage compartment. He removed 2 canteens of water, a small navigation kit, and a folded desert map. Reyes watched him. You're not thinking. Daniel handed him a canteen. We follow the road. Reyes looked down at the map. The nearest supply outpost is at least 30 kilometers. Daniel nodded. Then we start walking. Reyes stared at the empty road again. Then he took a deep breath. Well, he tightened the straps on his pack. Let's go find home. Daniel closed the vehicle door one last time. The 2 soldiers began walking down the desert road, step by step. The sun slowly moved lower behind them. Neither of them spoke for a long time. But in Daniel's mind, a single image appeared again and again. Not the desert, not the mission, not the storm. Home, somewhere far beyond the endless horizon. The sun slowly disappeared behind the desert dunes. The sky turned from bright blue to deep orange, then slowly into shades of purple and darkening gray. Daniel and Reyes kept walking, step after step, along the silent road. During the day, the desert felt endless, but at night, it felt even bigger. The heat of the afternoon began to fade quickly, replaced by a cold wind that moved across the open land. Reyes pulled his jacket tighter. I forgot how fast the desert cools down. Daniel nodded. That's why they teach us to respect it. They continued walking for another hour. The road stretched endlessly in front of them, a thin gray line between waves of sand. Finally, Reyes slowed down. Maybe we should stop for the night. Daniel looked up at the sky. Stars were beginning to appear, thousands of them, more stars than most people ever see in their lives. Out here, far from cities and lights, the universe felt closer. Daniel nodded. Yeah, this is a good place. They stepped off the road and sat beside a small dune. Reyes opened his pack and pulled out a small flashlight. Daniel checked the map again, under the dim light. We covered about 6 kilometers, he said. Reyes whistled quietly. Only 24 more to go. Daniel folded the map. We'll get there. Reyes looked at the sky. You always sound confident. Daniel shrugged slightly. It helps. For a few minutes they sat in silence. The desert wind whispered softly across the sand. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. Reyes took a small sip from his canteen. You ever think about what you're gonna do when all this is over? Daniel stared at the stars. Every day. Reyes smiled. So what is it? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered quietly. I want a normal morning. Reyes laughed softly. That's it? Daniel nodded. No alarms, no radios, no orders. He looked down at the sand. Just coffee. Reyes leaned back against the dune. I'd settle for a real bed. Daniel smiled slightly. They sat quietly again. Above them, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. After a while, Reyes spoke again. You got family waiting for you? Daniel's eyes remained on the stars. Yes. Reyes nodded slowly. That's good. Daniel didn't say anything else. But in his mind, memories began to surface. A small kitchen, morning sunlight through a window, a voice laughing in the next room, a life that felt very far away now. The desert wind continued moving across the dunes. Reyes eventually closed his eyes. "I'll take first rest," he murmured. Daniel remained awake, watching the sky, listening to the quiet desert, and thinking about the road ahead. Somewhere beyond the endless sand, home was still waiting, and tomorrow the walk would continue. The first light of morning slowly appeared over the desert. The sky turned pale blue as the sun began rising behind the dunes. Daniel had barely slept. He had spent most of the night watching the stars and listening to the quiet wind moving across the sand. When the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, he gently nudged Reyes. "Morning." Reyes opened his eyes slowly. "For a second I forgot where we were." Daniel smiled faintly. "I wish I could say the same." They packed their few supplies and stepped back onto the road. The desert was quiet again. No vehicles, no aircraft, no radio signals, just the long road stretching into the distance. They walked for nearly 2 hours. The sun climbed higher into the sky, bringing the heat back with it. Reyes wiped sweat from his forehead. "How much water do we have left?" Daniel checked the canteens. "Enough for today, if we're careful." Reyes nodded. They kept moving, step after step. The desert seemed to move with them, dunes shifting in the distance as warm airwaves danced above the sand. Then Reyes stopped. "Wait." Daniel turned. "What is it?" Reyes pointed toward the horizon. "At 11 o'clock. Daniel narrowed his eyes. At first he saw nothing. Then something appeared through the heat waves. A shape, small, rectangular. Daniel squinted harder. "That's not a rock." Reyes smiled slightly. "Nope." Daniel pulled the small binoculars from his pack. He raised them slowly. The image sharpened. A structure, concrete walls, a radio tower, broken but still standing. Daniel lowered the binoculars. "An outpost." Reyes exhaled with relief. "Finally." They picked up their pace. For the first time since the storm, hope moved through them like fresh energy. The structure slowly grew larger as they approached. It was old, weathered by sand and wind. A faded military marking remained on one wall. Daniel stepped inside the perimeter. The gate was half buried in sand. Reyes looked around. "Looks like nobody's been here for a while." Daniel entered the main building. Dust covered the floor. Old equipment sat quietly along the walls. But something important remained: the power console. Daniel walked toward it. Reyes followed. "You think it still works?" Daniel examined the panel. The system was old but simple. He flipped one switch. Nothing. He tried another. A faint click echoed through the room. Then a dim light flickered. Reyes's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be—" Daniel turned another dial. The old radio unit crackled to life. Static filled the room. But this time, it wasn't silence. Somewhere out there, a signal still existed. Daniel grabbed the microphone. "This is Sergeant Cole, requesting any available unit. Do you copy?" Static responded. Then a faint voice broke through. "Signal. Weak. Repeat." Reyes looked at Daniel. Hope returned to his face. Daniel pressed the microphone again. "This is Sergeant Cole. 2 personnel at abandoned outpost, requesting direction." The radio crackled. "Stand by." The signal faded again, but it had been enough. They were no longer invisible. Someone out there knew they existed. Reyes leaned back against the wall and laughed quietly. "I never thought I'd be so happy to hear static." Daniel smiled. Outside, the desert wind continued to move across the dunes. But now the silence no longer felt endless, because somewhere beyond the horizon, someone was listening. The old radio continued to crackle inside the abandoned outpost. Dust floated slowly through the sunlight, coming from the broken window. Daniel remained seated in front of the communication console, holding the microphone carefully, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile signal. Reyes stood near the doorway, watching the empty desert outside. For a few seconds, the radio was silent again. Then the static shifted. Cole, do you copy? Daniel immediately grabbed the microphone. This is Sergeant Daniel Cole. I copy. The signal faded, then returned again. Signal unstable, multiple bases currently on alert. Daniel glanced at Reyes. Reyes raised an eyebrow. The voice on the radio continued. Regional Command has ordered temporary movement restrictions. Several installations are operating under heightened security. Daniel listened carefully. The voice was calm, but the message carried urgency. Commercial routes in the region have been disrupted, naval traffic delayed, communication networks partially unstable. Reyes looked back at Daniel. That explains the silence. Daniel nodded slowly. The radio crackled again. Cole, confirm your current location. Daniel looked at the old map, spread across the dusty table. We are at an abandoned desert outpost, approximately 30 kilometers south of the main supply road. Static. Then the voice returned. Copy that. Stand by for route instruction. The signal weakened again. Reyes leaned against the wall. Sounds like the whole region is on edge. Daniel adjusted the radio dial. That happens sometimes. The radio suddenly came back stronger. Cole, listen carefully. Daniel leaned closer. Nearest operational base is 70 kilometers north. However, the main road is currently restricted. Reyes shook his head. 70? Daniel remained focused. The voice continued. There is an older service road running east from your location. It reconnects with a logistics corridor approximately 40 kilometers away. Daniel marked the map with a pencil. 40 kilometers east. Correct. Follow that road. Additional units are expected to pass through that corridor within the next 24 hours. Reyes looked relieved. So, we're not the only ones moving around out here. Daniel nodded. The radio crackled again. Cole, maintain radio monitoring when possible, and report movement every few hours. Daniel answered calmly. Understood. The signal faded again. And Sergeant, Daniel paused. Yes? The voice returned one final time. Good luck getting home. The radio went silent. Reyes looked at Daniel and smiled. Well, looks like we've got a direction. Daniel folded the map, slowly. Outside, the desert wind continued to move the sand across the ground. But now, the road ahead had meaning again. He stood up and picked up his pack. East, he said. Reyes grabbed his gear. East it is. They stepped outside the abandoned outpost. The morning sun was now bright above the desert. Daniel looked toward the endless horizon. Somewhere beyond that direction, beyond the sand, the silence, and the long road, home was waiting, and now they had a path to follow. The desert road heading east was older than the main supply route. Cracks ran across the asphalt, and in many places the sand had already begun to reclaim the pavement. But it was still a road, and right now that was enough. Daniel and Reyes walked steadily under the rising sun. The heat returned quickly, wrapping the desert in waves of shimmering air. Neither of them spoke much. They had entered the rhythm of long-distance walking, a quiet balance between endurance and patience. After 2 hours, Reyes finally broke the silence. How far now? Daniel looked at the map. About 20 kilometers left. Reyes nodded slowly. Halfway. They kept moving. The desert stretched endlessly around them. The wind shifted occasionally, pushing soft waves of sand across the old road. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Their shadows grew shorter beneath their feet. Then something changed. Daniel stopped walking. Reyes noticed immediately. What is it? Daniel tilted his head slightly. Listen. At first Reyes heard nothing, just wind. Then, very faintly, a distant rumble, low, deep, almost like thunder. Reyes looked toward the horizon. You hear that too? Daniel nodded. It's not thunder. The sound grew slightly louder, still far away, but steady. Reyes shaded his eyes and looked east. Could be vehicles. Daniel raised the binoculars again. Heat waves blurred the horizon. For several seconds he saw nothing. Then, movement. Small shapes, a thin line of dust rising in the distance. Daniel lowered the binoculars slowly. Well? Reyes waited. What? Daniel allowed himself a small smile. I think we just found our ride. Reyes laughed in disbelief. You're serious? Daniel handed him the binoculars. Reyes looked, and then he saw it. A convoy, several transport vehicles moving slowly across the desert road. The dust behind them stretched across the horizon like a long trail. Reyes lowered the binoculars. That might be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Daniel chuckled quietly. They stepped to the side of the road and waited. The distant rumble grew louder. Engines, heavy vehicles. The convoy slowly approached. Within minutes, the shapes became clearer. Large supply trucks, escort vehicles, military markings faded by sand and sun. Daniel stepped closer to the road. The lead vehicle slowed, then stopped. The door opened. A lieutenant stepped down and looked at them. For a moment, he studied their dusty uniforms and tired faces. Then he smiled. Well, I'll be. He walked closer. You two look like you've had quite a walk. Reyes laughed. You have no idea. Daniel nodded respectfully. Sergeant Daniel Cole, Escort Unit Bravo. The lieutenant nodded back. Lieutenant Harris. He looked toward the horizon behind them. Where did you come from? Daniel pointed west. Long story. Harris chuckled. Well, lucky for you. He gestured toward the convoy. We're heading exactly where you need to go. Reyes looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the road ahead. For the first time since the storm, the journey no longer felt endless. Home was finally getting closer. The convoy moved slowly across the desert road. Large transport trucks rolled steadily forward, their engines humming in a deep, constant rhythm. Daniel sat in the back of one of the vehicles beside Reyes, watching the desert pass by through the open rear door. The wind rushed past them, carrying the dry scent of sand and sun-heated earth. For the first time in days, they were no longer walking. Reyes stretched his legs. I forgot how good it feels to sit down. Daniel smiled slightly. Your feet will remember later. Reyes laughed. That's a tomorrow problem. The convoy continued east. Truck after truck followed the narrow desert road like a long mechanical caravan moving through an ocean of sand. After nearly an hour, the radio mounted near the driver crackled to life. The lieutenant in the front seat picked up the microphone. Convoy leader to all units, checkpoint approaching in 10 minutes. Daniel glanced toward the front of the vehicle. Checkpoint? Reyes nodded. That must be the logistics corridor they mentioned. The convoy slowed slightly as it approached a low ridge of desert rock. As they passed over the rise, a small base appeared in the distance. Not large, just a few reinforced buildings, several antenna towers, and rows of parked military vehicles. But to Daniel, it looked like the most welcoming place on Earth. The convoy rolled toward the entrance gate. Guards stood watch beside the road, scanning the vehicles as they entered. When their truck stopped, Daniel and Reyes stepped down. The ground felt strange beneath their boots after the long ride. A communications officer approached them holding a clipboard. "Sergeant Cole?" Daniel nodded. "That's me." The officer checked the paper briefly. "Command left a note for you." Daniel looked surprised. "For me?" The officer handed him a small folded message. "Arrived through the relay network earlier today." Daniel unfolded the paper slowly. The message was short, only a few lines. But his expression changed as he read it. Reyes noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel looked up. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he handed the paper to Reyes. Reyes read it silently. His eyebrows lifted. "Well," he looked back at Daniel with a wide grin. "Looks like somebody is waiting for you." Daniel took the message back. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stood out, a message forwarded through several bases, a message that had traveled across thousands of kilometers just to reach him. It read, "Your leave has been approved. Return home authorization confirmed." Daniel exhaled slowly. For days, the desert had seemed endless. But now, the road ahead had changed. This journey was no longer just about survival. It was about going home. The journey north from the logistics base took almost a full day. Military transport aircraft carried personnel across long distances, connecting bases scattered across continents. Daniel barely spoke during the flight. He sat quietly by the small, round window of the aircraft, watching the clouds pass below. For days he had walked across the desert. Now, the world seemed to move beneath him. Reyes sat across the aisle. "So, this is it?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Almost." Hours later, the aircraft descended toward its final destination. Through the window, Daniel could see a familiar landscape appearing beneath the clouds. Cities, rivers, roads filled with moving lights, places where ordinary life continued every single day. The aircraft touched down smoothly on the runway. When the rear door opened, cool air rushed inside. Daniel stepped down onto the ground. For the first time in a long time, he felt the solid certainty of home soil beneath his boots. Several transport buses waited nearby. Reyes stretched his shoulders. "Feels strange being back." Daniel looked around the airfield. "It does." They boarded the bus that would take them to the processing center. After a few hours of paperwork, briefings, and quiet conversations with other returning soldiers, Daniel finally stepped outside again. The evening sun was beginning to set. The air felt different here, familiar. Reyes approached him, carrying a small bag. "Well, Sergeant, looks like this is where we go separate ways." Daniel smiled. "Looks like it." Reyes extended his hand. "Take care of that normal morning you talked about." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "You too." Reyes walked toward another transport vehicle. Daniel watched him disappear into the distance. Then he turned toward the parking lot. A simple taxi waited near the curb. The driver opened the trunk and helped him place his bag inside. "Where to?" the driver asked. Daniel gave the address quietly. The city moved slowly past the windows As the taxi drove through familiar streets, streetlights flickered on one by one as evening settled across the neighborhood. Finally, the taxi stopped. Daniel stepped out. For a moment, he simply stood there. The house in front of him looked exactly the same. The same small yard, the same porch, the same quiet street. But after everything he had been through, it felt different. He walked slowly toward the front door. His hand paused above the doorbell. For a second he hesitated, then he knocked gently. Inside the house, footsteps approached. The door opened. For a moment no one spoke. Then a voice broke the silence. "You're home!" Daniel smiled. Yes. And in that quiet moment, the longest road he had ever walked finally came to an end.